In the heart of the ancient world, where empires rose and fell like waves on a restless sea, one story refuses to fade into dust. It begins with a king whose ambition knew no limits, a sacred temple standing defiantly in the desert, and 50,000 soldiers who marched into the sands and never returned. For centuries, their fate has haunted historians, baffled scientists, and inspired legends of gods, curses, and hidden rebellions. Tonight, we travel back more than 2,000 years to follow their footprints across the blazing dunes of Egypt and confront the mystery that swallowed an entire army whole.
In the 6th century before Christ, the Persian Empire was the most powerful civilization on Earth, stretching from the valleys of the Indus to the shores of the Mediterranean. It was a realm of immense wealth, military might, and political ambition. Cities bustled with traders from every corner of the known world. Roads paved the way for swift messengers who carried the king's commands across thousands of miles. Under the reign of Cyrus the Great, the empire had risen from obscurity to dominate nearly everything in its path. But it was Cyrus's son, Cambyses too, who would inherit not only this vast dominion, but also his father's hunger for conquest. Cambyses was no ordinary king. Descriptions from ancient sources paint him as fierce, intelligent, and, at times, merciless. To him, an empire was never complete while there were lands beyond its borders left unconquered. And there was one kingdom in particular that drew his gaze like a moth to flame. Egypt. Egypt was more than a land of sand and river. It was a civilization as old as memory itself, a place of towering temples, mighty pharaohs, and treasures that glimmered in the desert sun. To conquer Egypt was not just to expand territory. It was to seize the wealth of the Nile, the granaries that could feed entire armies, and the prestige of ruling the most ancient kingdom in the world. Cambyses knew this. He also knew that the Egyptians considered themselves blessed by their gods, protected by the power of the pharaoh, and destined to endure forever. For Cambyses, this was a challenge. To defeat Egypt would prove that even the most sacred of lands could fall before the might of Persia. It would send a message to every corner of his empire and beyond. The Persians were unstoppable, chosen by fate to rule the earth. By 525 BC, Cambyses had prepared his armies and launched his invasion. It was a campaign of immense scale. The Persians crossed the desert with the help of Arab allies who supplied water and provisions. Battles were fought, cities fell, and soon the proud pharaoh Psamtik III was captured. Egypt, the kingdom of the Nile, became another jewel in the Persian crown. Yet for Cambyses' victory was not enough. Conquerors rarely stop at borders. To the west of the Nile, beyond the green fields and palm trees, stretched the endless Sahara. Somewhere deep within that expanse of golden emptiness lay the Siwa oasis, home to the famed Temple of Amun. This was no ordinary sanctuary. The oracle of Amen at Siwa was said to speak the will of the gods themselves. Pharaohs had come to it for guidance, generals for blessings, kings for reassurance that their reign was divinely approved. To Cambyses, this temple represented defiance. Even as Persia's banners flew over Egyptian cities, the priests of Amun whispered that Cambyses was not the rightful ruler, that the gods did not favor him. The oracle's reputation reached across the ancient world, its words carrying the weight of divine judgment. For a king who demanded absolute power, such defiance was intolerable. But there was more than pride at stake. Some sources claimed that the oracle prophesied disaster for Cambyses, predicting his downfall or humiliation. Others suggest that the priests simply refused to recognize him as pharaoh. Whatever the truth, Cambyses saw the temple as both a political threat and a spiritual insult. If the people believed the gods opposed him, rebellion could simmer beneath the surface of his newly conquered lands. So Cambyses made a decision that would echo through history. He would send an army to march across the desert, reach the Siwa oasis, and destroy the Temple of Amun. The priests would be silenced, the oracle humbled, and the king's authority made absolute. It was a bold plan. The desert west of the Nile was no ordinary wilderness. Travelers spoke of shifting sands that swallowed landmarks overnight, of winds that could strip flesh from bone, of mirages that lured the thirsty to their deaths. To cross it with an army of tens of thousands was a feat few would dare attempt. Yet Cambyses was undeterred. He had conquered Egypt itself. What was a mere desert compared to the armies he had already defeated? 50,000 men were chosen for the mission. According to the account of Herodotus, the Greek historian whose writings remain one of our main sources for these events, it was a formidable force. Soldiers armed with spears and bows, supported by supply carriers and guides familiar with the terrain. They set out from Thebes, marching westward into the blazing sun. Their orders were clear: reach Siwa, burn the temple, and return victorious. What happened next is one of history's great mysteries. Herodotus tells us that the army marched for days, reaching an oasis halfway to Siwa. There they rested, gathering water for the next stage of the journey. Then they pressed on toward their destination. But somewhere between that halfway point and Siwa, the desert swallowed them. Not a single man returned. Not a weapon, not a shield, not even a scrap of clothing was ever found in the centuries that followed. The official story, at least according to Herodotus, was that a massive sandstorm descended upon the army. Walls of wind and dust rolled across the desert, burying 50,000 men beneath tons of sand. The soldiers, the weapons, the banners of Persia, everything vanished as though the earth itself had opened to consume them. For over 2,000 years, this explanation endured. The lost army of Cambyses, as it came to be called, became a legend. Some saw it as divine punishment for attacking a sacred temple. Others viewed it as a warning about the hubris of kings who defied the gods. And for generations, treasure hunters, explorers, and archaeologists scoured the desert, hoping to find some trace of the army that vanished into myth. Yet even as the story spread, doubts grew. Could an entire army really disappear without a trace? Could a sandstorm, no matter how fierce, erase 50,000 men from history? Or was there another explanation, one involving betrayal, rebellion, or secrets too dangerous for ancient chroniclers to reveal? As we continue this journey, we will follow the clues left across centuries of history. We will hear the voices of ancient historians, modern archaeologists, and the desert itself as it guards its secrets. Because somewhere, between legend and reality, lies the truth about Cambyses' lost army, and the search for that truth is only beginning. Long before Cambyses sent his soldiers into the desert, the Temple of Amun at Siwa was already a place wrapped in mystery. To the people of Egypt, it was more than a sanctuary of stone and columns. It was the dwelling place of a god who spoke. Through oracles, a voice that guided kings, foretold victories, and warned of coming doom. Travelers from distant lands came to hear the words of Amun. Pharaohs bowed before his priests, seeking assurance that the divine favored their reigns. By the time Cambyses conquered Egypt, the oracle of Amun had centuries of prestige behind it. Its prophecies shaped politics, inspired rebellions, and granted legitimacy to rulers. A single pronouncement from the oracle could lift a king to divine status or cast him into shadow as an enemy of the gods. For a ruler who wished to dominate, both body and spirit, controlling such a voice was essential. Yet Cambyses faced a problem. Ancient sources suggest the priests of Amun refused to acknowledge him as the rightful pharaoh. Some claimed the oracle predicted disaster if he dared attack the temple. Others hinted at darker warnings, that his reign would end in chaos, that the gods themselves opposed his ambitions. Whether these words were actually spoken or invented later by his enemies, we cannot know. What we do know is this: Cambyses believed the oracle threatened his authority. Imagine the scene. The Persian king, newly victorious over Egypt, hearing whispers that a temple deep in the desert defies him. Priests murmuring to pilgrims that Cambyses lacks divine favor. A prophecy spreading among soldiers and citizens alike, hinting that the gods will strike him down. For a conqueror trying to secure his rule, such rumors were poison. Persian kings claimed divine support for their power. Their inscriptions spoke of Ahura Mazda, the great god of Zoroastrianism, granting them kingship over lands and peoples. To admit that another god, worshipped by Egyptians for centuries, opposed them would be to show weakness. Cambyses, proud and ambitious, could not allow that, so he resolved to act. The Temple of Amun would be silenced. Its priests would be punished. The oracle that questioned his right to rule would speak no more. But to reach Siwa was no easy task. The oasis lay hundreds of miles west of the Nile, surrounded by seas of sand where even caravans sometimes vanished without trace. Herodotus tells us. Cambyses sent an army of 50,000 men. Modern historians debate the number, but there is. No doubt it was large enough to carry weapons, supplies, and the authority of the king himself. These were soldiers hardened by campaigns across deserts and mountains. They had conquered Egypt's cities and defeated its armies. Surely the empty sands of the West could not stop them. Yet here is where history grows silent and legend begins. According to Herodotus, the army marched from Thebes, reaching an oasis halfway to Siwa after 7 days. There they rested, drawing water from wells shaded by palms. Then they pressed on, guided by men who knew the desert paths. Somewhere beyond that point, between the halfway oasis and Siwa itself, the army disappeared. Herodotus writes that as they crossed the desert, a great wind rose from the south. It grew into a storm, a wall of sand and dust sweeping across the horizon. The soldiers huddled together as the sky turned dark. Then the wind buried them, smothering men, animals, and weapons beneath mountains of shifting sand. When the storm passed, nothing remained. The desert was empty once more. For centuries, this was the story people told. The lost army of Cambyses, swallowed by a wrathful desert as punishment for defying the gods. To the Egyptians, it was divine justice. The priests of Amun, untouched in their oasis, could point to the sands and say, "The gods protect us." Even the might of Persia cannot silence their will. But modern scholars question this tale. Could a sandstorm truly erase 50,000 men without leaving a single trace? Desert storms can be deadly, yes, but entire armies have survived them. Throughout history, why not this one? Some suggest Herodotus repeated a legend rather than a fact, that the story grew over time until the army's fate became a myth of divine vengeance. Others propose different explanations. Perhaps the army turned against Cambyses, joining rebels who opposed Persian rule. Perhaps rival tribes ambushed them, killing some and scattering others so completely that no record survived. The desert is vast, and human violence can erase, lives as thoroughly as any storm. Still, the image of 50,000 soldiers vanishing beneath the sand lingers in the imagination. Ancient travelers claimed to see bones and weapons half buried in remote dunes, as if the desert itself occasionally revealed fragments of its secret before swallowing them again. Roman explorers later spoke of skeletons bleached by centuries, of sun shields glinting among the dunes. Whether these tales were true or born of campfire storytelling, they kept the mystery alive. Meanwhile, the Temple of Amun endured. Pilgrims continued to visit its oracle, seeking wisdom from priests who spoke for the gods. Centuries after Cambyses, even Alexander the Great would come to Siwa, hoping the oracle would declare him son of Zeus and rightful ruler of the world. The temple never lost its power to shape kings and empires. As for Cambyses, ancient sources disagree on how much he knew of the disaster. Some say news never reached him, that the desert simply kept its secret. Others claim survivors returned with tales of the storm, filling the king with dread that the gods had cursed him. Herodotus even suggests Cambyses descended into madness in his later years, haunted by failure and rebellion. Whether or not the oracle truly predicted his downfall, Cambyses' reign did unravel. Revolts erupted across the empire. He died only a few years after conquering Egypt, under circumstances as mysterious as the fate of his lost army. Some claimed accident, others suicide. Still others divine punishment for defying the gods. Thus the story grew, a proud king, a sacred temple, an army swallowed by the desert, and a prophecy fulfilled. It was the kind of tale ancient people loved, where human ambition collides with divine will and nature itself delivers judgment. Yet history is rarely so simple. The sands of Egypt keep their secrets well, and as centuries passed, the mystery only deepened. Explorers searched for evidence, scholars argued over Herodotus' account, and legends spread across continents. Was it truly a storm? A rebellion? A battle lost and forgotten? Each theory added new layers to the story, but none erased its power. Even today, the thought of 50,000 men marching into the desert and never returning stirs the imagination. The silence of the sands seems almost deliberate, as if the earth itself conspires to keep the truth hidden. And so we continue our journey, following the path of Cambyses' soldiers toward the heart of the desert. Ahead lies the story of that march, the mysteries recorded by ancient historians, and the clues left scattered across time. Somewhere between history and legend, the fate of the lost army waits to be uncovered. The march into the western desert began with the confidence of victory. Cambyses had conquered Egypt in less than a year. Its cities had fallen, its pharaoh was captured, and Persian banners now waved along the banks of the Nile. For the soldiers gathering in Thebes, the mission to Siwa must have seemed straightforward. A march across sand, a temple to destroy, priests to silence, and then a return to the comforts of the Nile Valley. 50,000 men, according to Herodotus, left the city under the blazing sun. They carried spears, bows, shields, and supplies, packed onto the backs of camels and donkeys. Guides who knew the desert accompanied them, men from tribes who had lived for generations among the dunes. These guides promised to lead the army across the empty wilderness to the oasis where the Temple of Amun stood. At first, the march was uneventful. The soldiers followed narrow trails worn by caravans, paths winding through low hills of rock and sand. The Nile's green valley faded behind them as they entered the barren lands beyond. Day by day, the sun burned hotter, the air drier, the horizon wider and emptier. Ancient sources give few details about this part of the journey, but we can imagine the scene, the army moving in long columns across the desert floor, dust rising beneath thousands of feet, water skins strapped to pack animals, officers shouting orders as the sun climbed higher, nights spent around small fires beneath a sky thick with stars. After 7 days, they reached the first oasis, likely the modern cargo oasis, about halfway between the Nile and Siwa here. Palms and acacia trees surrounded pools of water, wells, provided fresh supplies for men and animals alike. The soldiers rested in the shade, filled their water skins, and prepared for the second half of the march. So far, nothing seemed unusual. Armies had crossed deserts before, with enough water, food, and discipline. The journey to Siwa should have been difficult, but not impossible. Yet something happened after they left this oasis that would turn the expedition into one of history's great mysteries. Herodotus tells us only that the army disappeared. Between the first oasis and Siwa, he gives no details about how far they marched before disaster struck. No names of survivors, no description beyond the image of a vast sandstorm burying every man. One moment, 50,000 soldiers marched toward the horizon. The next, the desert erased them. For generations, storytellers filled this silence with imagination. Some described walls of wind and sand rolling across the desert like an ocean, suffocating men and animals alike. Others spoke of whirlwinds, so fierce they stripped flesh from bone, leaving only skeletons beneath the dunes. The desert, they said, does not give back what it takes. But even in antiquity, doubts crept in. Could nature alone destroy so many without leaving a trace? Battles left weapons, bones, and fragments of campsites scattered across fields for centuries. Entire cities destroyed by war or fire still left ruins for archaeologists to find. Yet the desert where Cambyses' army vanished remained silent, hiding its secrets beneath shifting sands. Modern historians point out that Herodotus wrote decades after the events. He relied on travelers' tales, rumors from locals, and perhaps Egyptian priests eager to portray Cambyses as a king cursed by the gods. The story of divine punishment suited their purposes well. A king who defied the oracle of Amun sends an army against it, and the gods bury his soldiers beneath the sand. It was a tale both moral and memorable, a warning about pride and sacrilege. Yet there are hints that human hands, not divine winds, may have destroyed the army. Later sources speak of revolts in western Egypt led by a mysterious figure named Petit. Some scholars believe he ambushed the Persians in the desert, using his knowledge of the land to trap them far from help. A defeated army could vanish if survivors scattered, supplies burned, and bodies left to the scavengers and the sands. Still, no evidence proves this theory either. The desert gives away nothing easily. Bones crumble in heat and wind. Sand covers campsites, weapons, and roads until they vanish beneath dunes that shift like waves. Even if battle, rebellion, or storm destroyed the army, 2,500 years have hidden nearly every trace. Imagine the soldiers themselves during those final days. The sun beating down, water running low, guides growing nervous as familiar landmarks disappear. Perhaps they saw mirages shimmering on the horizon lakes that vanished when approached. Cities of light that dissolved into empty air. Caravan travelers for centuries have reported such visions, tricks of heat and distance that lure the thirsty toward death at night. The wind might have carried strange sounds across the desert. The creaking of dunes, the cries of distant animals, the whisper of shifting sands. To soldiers far from home, these noises could sound like voices of spirits or angry gods. Fear spreads quickly in such places, and armies are not immune to panic. Some legends claim a few survivors reached Siwa long after the disaster, telling priests of a storm that struck without warning. Others insist no one survived at all, that the desert swallowed the army completely. Without written records from Cambyses' court, we cannot know what news, if any, returned to the king. What we do know is that Cambyses never punished the Temple of Amun. The oracle continued speaking to pilgrims for centuries afterward. Alexander the Great himself visited Siwa 200 years later, seeking divine approval for his own conquests. The temple stood unharmed, its priests untouched, as if the desert itself had risen to protect them. Over time, the story of the lost army grew into legend. Roman writers repeated it. Medieval travelers embroidered it with new details. By the 19th century, European explorers hunted for evidence, convinced that somewhere beneath the dunes lay weapons, armor, and gold from Cambyses' soldiers. A few discoveries fueled their hopes. Fragments of weapons, bits of pottery, even human bones occasionally surfaced after storms. Each find sparked excitement, yet none proved the fate of 50,000 men. The desert reveals only what it chooses, and it has chosen to remain silent about Cambyses' army. Today, satellite images scan the sands where the army marched. Archaeologists dig at oases and along ancient caravan routes, yet the mystery endures. Storm, battle, rebellion, or all three, no theory fully explains how an entire army vanished so completely. As we leave the soldiers marching westward into silence, the story turns to those who came after, the explorers, scholars, and dreamers, who refused to let the desert keep its secret. Their quests across centuries form the next chapter in this enduring mystery. Centuries passed, yet the story of Cambyses' lost army refused to fade. In markets from Memphis to Athens, in caravans resting at desert oases, travelers repeated the tale of 50,000 men swallowed by the sands. Each retelling added new colors, new terrors, until the line between history and legend blurred like heat shimmering on the horizon. Herodotus was the first to set the story down in writing, giving it shape for the ancient world. He described the army marching into the desert, the wind rising, the storm descending, and then silence. No survivors, no witnesses, only the endless dunes stretching beneath the sun. For Greeks who read his histories, the tale confirmed what they already believed, that hubris invites punishment, and the gods use nature itself as their instrument. In the centuries after Herodotus, the story traveled with merchants, priests, and soldiers. Caravan routes linked Egypt with the Mediterranean, Arabia, and beyond. Around campfires, men spoke of the desert that devoured armies, of voices carried by the wind at night, of golden shields buried beneath mountains of sand. The tale spread because it was both terrifying and satisfying. Terrifying because it suggested the desert held powers beyond human control. Satisfying because it turned a conquering king into a victim of his own arrogance. Egyptian priests may have encouraged the story's growth. To them, Cambyses was a foreign tyrant who mocked their gods and desecrated temples. If the desert destroyed his army, it proved divine justice. Each retelling served as both warning and comfort. Defy the gods, and even kings will vanish without a trace. By the time Alexander the Great marched into Egypt 2 centuries later, the legend was well known. Alexander himself visited the oracle at Siwa, the very temple Cambyses had tried to destroy. Ancient writers claimed the priests greeted him as the son of Amun, granting him legitimacy as both pharaoh and conqueror. Perhaps Alexander remembered Cambyses' fate as he approached the temple. Perhaps the story influenced his decision to seek the god's favor rather than his wrath. Roman authors inherited the legend and retold it for new audiences. To them, the lost army showed the limits of imperial power. Rome conquered deserts, mountains, and seas, yet the story from Persia warned that nature could humble even the mightiest empire. Pliny the Elder wrote of deserts where no life survived, where winds erased footprints within moments, where travelers vanished as if the earth itself swallowed them. The army of Cambyses became the ultimate example, proof that the natural world was as dangerous as any enemy. As centuries turned to millennia, the tale moved along new trade routes into Arabia and North Africa. Muslim scholars repeated it in medieval chronicles, sometimes adding Islamic themes of divine punishment and moral lesson. The army became not just Persians marching to Siwa, but arrogant unbelievers defying God's will. In this way, the story adapted to each culture, absorbing local beliefs while keeping its central mystery intact. Travelers to Egypt during the Middle Ages claimed Bedouin tribes knew the location of the buried army. Some spoke of skeletons uncovered after storms, of weapons glinting in the sun before vanishing again beneath shifting sands. Others insisted the army marched into a cursed region where no birds flew and no water flowed, a place guarded by spirits. Of the desert, European pilgrims returning from the Holy Land carried these stories home. In monasteries and castles, listeners imagined endless dunes stretching beyond the known world, hiding treasures and tragedies beneath their waves of sand. Medieval maps marked parts of the Sahara with warnings. Here be monsters, here be death. The lost army fit naturally into this vision of deserts as realms of danger and mystery. During the Renaissance, when classical texts returned to European scholars, Herodotus's account reignited interest. Painters imagined scenes of soldiers blinded by sand, camels collapsing beneath blackened skies, priests at Siwa, watching from afar as divine wrath consumed their enemies. Poets described the desert as a living thing, a serpent of wind and fire, uncoiling across the land. Yet the more artists and writers embroidered the tale, the less certain its facts became. Was it truly 50,000 men? Did any survive? Was it a single storm or a series of disasters, thirst, rebellion, exhaustion striking one after another? Each generation retold the story according to its fears and beliefs. For some, the desert was punishment from heaven. For others, it was chaos without meaning, nature indifferent to human ambition. By the 19th century, when European explorers reached the oases of Western Egypt, they carried centuries of legend with them. Some expected to find entire regiments perfectly preserved beneath the sand, as if sleeping soldiers might rise again when uncovered. Others searched for treasure gold weapons, perhaps even royal insignia from Cambyses' court. These explorers recorded local tales that kept the legend alive. Bedouin guides spoke of storms that appeared without warning, walls of sand higher than palm trees moving faster than horses could run. They told of valleys where bones surfaced after windstorms, only to vanish again beneath the dunes within days. Whether these were memories of real events or stories shaped by centuries of repetition, no one could say. The legend even influenced colonial ambitions. European powers mapping Africa in the 19th century viewed the Sahara as both obstacle and opportunity. Finding Cambyses' army promised fame for archaeologists and proof of Western science's power over nature. Yet expedition after expedition returned with little more than rumors, fragments, and frustration. Still, the story refused to die. Novelists used it as inspiration for tales of lost cities and cursed treasures. Historians debated whether Herodotus invented details or preserved a genuine memory of disaster. Scientists studied desert weather patterns, searching for storms fierce enough to erase entire armies. Each field, literature, history, science claimed part of the mystery as its own. What makes the legend so enduring is its balance of scale and silence. 50,000 men is an enormous number. Armies leave footprints in history documents, monuments, artifacts, but this one left almost nothing. That absence invites imagination. A single shield found in the dunes sparks visions of regiments marching to their doom. A scattering of bones suggests thousands more buried nearby. Even today, local guides around Siwa tell visitors about the army of Cambyses. Some point toward distant ridges and claim the soldiers sleep beneath them. Others warn travelers not to wander too far, lest the desert claim more victims. For tourists, the story adds romance to the landscape. For archaeologists, it remains both challenge and temptation. The persistence of the legend shows how human memory works in places where written records are scarce. Oral tales carry fragments across generations, changing details but preserving core events. Something happened in the desert 25 centuries ago, something dramatic enough to echo through history, whether storm, rebellion, or both. The fate of Cambyses' army survives because people kept asking questions, spinning answers, and passing them on. As we leave the realm of legend behind, the story moves toward modern times, when explorers, armed with maps, compasses, and later satellites, tried to solve the mystery once and for all. Their efforts and the discoveries that followed formed the next chapter in this long pursuit across history and sand. By the dawn of the 19th century, the legend of Cambyses' lost army had traveled far beyond the deserts of Egypt. Scholars in London, Paris, and Berlin debated its truth, while explorers dreamed of solving one of history's greatest mysteries. Empires now spanned continents, science challenged superstition, and technology promised answers where ancient chronicles had left only questions. Yet the Sahara remained a place where ambition met its limits. The first wave of explorers arrived with caravans of camels, guided by Bedouins who knew the rhythms of the desert. These travelers carried notebooks instead of swords, sextants instead of shields. Their goal was not conquest, but discovery. Many believed the sands near the Siwa oasis concealed the remains of Cambyses' army, weapons, armor, perhaps even royal banners, buried beneath the dunes for over 2,000 years. In 1818, the British explorer William Brown reported hearing local tales about skeletons uncovered after violent sandstorms. He claimed Bedouins had found arrowheads, fragments of bronze, and even human bones bleached white by centuries under the sun. Yet when Brown searched himself, the desert gave him nothing but heat and silence. His writings reignited interest. In Europe, when newspapers speculated that the lost army might soon be found, decade after decade, expeditions followed. French, Italian, and German explorers crossed the Libyan desert, armed with maps and determination. Some carried early cameras, hoping to document proof at last. Others brought archaeologists, eager to compare any discoveries with Persian artifacts in museums. Yet the desert defied them all. Sandstorms erased landmarks overnight. Wells dried up, forcing expeditions to turn back before reaching the most promising sites. In some cases, entire caravans vanished, victims not of legend but of thirst, exhaustion, or miscalculation. The Sahara reminded modern travelers of the same truth Cambyses had learned centuries earlier. It was a kingdom where nature ruled absolutely. By the early 20th century, technology promised new advantages. Motor vehicles replaced camels on some expeditions. Airplanes flew over regions no European had seen before. From above, explorers scanned for unusual shapes, lines of mounds, patterns suggesting buried structures, anything that might mark the path of 50,000 men. In 1933, a remarkable story emerged. Hungarian explorer Eliseel Almasi, later famous as the inspiration for the English Patient, claimed Bedouins had shown him ancient remains in the desert, arrowheads, weapons, even human bones scattered across remote dunes. Almasi believed these could belong to Cambyses' army. Newspapers across Europe seized the story, printing headlines about the mystery finally solved. But skeptics questioned his evidence. The desert held traces of many travelers, Roman patrols, medieval caravans, even modern Bedouin tribes. How could anyone prove which bones or weapons belonged to Cambyses' men? Without inscriptions or Persian royal symbols, the claims faded into uncertainty. After World War II, interest revived with new tools. Archaeologists used aerial photography to map regions inaccessible by foot. Some believed wind patterns might reveal where sandstorms were most likely to expose buried artifacts. Others studied ancient trade routes, calculating where an army marching towards Siwa might have camped, fought, or perished. In the 1970s, Egyptian archaeologists discovered several sites containing human remains in the western desert. Some skeletons showed signs of sudden death, perhaps thirst or exposure while nearby. Fragments of weapons suggested a violent end. Yet dating techniques placed some remains centuries after Cambyses, complicating the story further. Were these victims of later battles, unlucky caravans, or echoes of the ancient disaster itself? Satellite imagery in the late 20th century offered even greater possibilities. Scientists could now scan vast stretches of desert for anomalies, buried riverbeds, ancient trails, or clusters of stone that might indicate human activity. Teams identified several promising locations between the Nile and Siwa oasis. Some showed signs of temporary campsites large enough to hold thousands. Yet excavation proved difficult. Permits, funding, and the sheer hostility of the environment slowed progress to a crawl. In 2009, two Italian researchers, Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione, announced what they claimed was definitive evidence. Using satellite images and ground surveys, they located an area in the Egyptian desert containing bronze weapons, arrowheads, and pieces of ancient jewelry. Nearby lay human bones, broken and scattered, as if by violent force. The Castigliones argued this matched Herodotus's account. A Persian army struck by a sudden sandstorm, overwhelmed before it could reach Siwa. Their findings made international headlines. Documentaries followed, showing gleaming artifacts against backgrounds of golden dunes. Many viewers believed the mystery solved at last. Yet once again, debate erupted among scholars. Critics argued the dating of the artifacts was uncertain. Some items appeared Persian, but others seemed from later periods. Without inscriptions naming Cambyses or connecting the site directly to his campaign, doubt lingered. History demanded proof, stronger than legend or coincidence. Modern climatologists added another perspective, studying weather patterns. They noted that the Sahara occasionally experiences massive haboobs, towering walls of sand driven by sudden winds. Some storms stretch for miles, with winds fierce enough to bury entire camps within minutes. Computer models suggested such a storm could indeed overwhelm thousands, especially if soldiers were already weakened by heat and lack of water. But historians countered with another theory: rebellion. Ancient sources hint that part of Cambyses' army may have turned against him or deserted in the desert's chaos. Perhaps internal conflict, not nature alone, destroyed the force. Some soldiers might have fled south toward Nubia or west toward Carthage, leaving little trace as they scattered across Africa. Archaeology, climate science, and historical analysis thus formed three competing explanations: divine punishment through sandstorm, slow death by thirst and exposure, or human betrayal amid impossible conditions. Each theory fit parts of the evidence, yet left questions unanswered. Meanwhile, the legend continued, attracting adventurers. Treasure hunters searched for gold and royal insignia. Amateur historians scoured satellite maps from home computers, convinced they could spot clues professionals missed. The mystery's allure lay partly in its defiance of certainty. For every discovery, new doubts arose. Even today, expeditions occasionally uncover artifacts in the western desert arrowheads, pottery, traces of ancient campsites. Each finds sparks headlines suggesting the lost army lies just beyond the next dune. Yet the Sahara keeps its secrets well. Shifting sands bury evidence as quickly as they reveal it, ensuring that absolute proof remains tantalizingly out of reach. What emerges from 2 centuries of modern searching is not a single answer, but a portrait of human persistence. From Victorian explorers with camels to scientists armed with satellites, generations have crossed the same unforgiving landscape, chasing the same legend. The desert defeated Cambyses, yet it also defeated many who sought to explain his fate. As the 21st century advances, new technologies, ground-penetrating radar, drone surveys, even DNA analysis of ancient bones, pressure attempts to solve the mystery. Perhaps one day a royal inscription will surface, or a mass grave precisely dated to 525 BCE. Until then, the lost army of Cambyses remains suspended between history and myth, half buried beneath both sand and story. And so we arrive at the final chapter of this journey: what the mystery means today, why it endures, and how it shapes our understanding of ambition, empire, and the relentless power of nature itself. The story of Cambyses' lost army does not end with the last sandstorm or the final expedition returning empty-handed. Instead, it lingers like a ghost at the edge of history, shaping how we imagine the ancient world and how we interpret its silences. For more than 2 millennia, this mystery has crossed borders, languages, and generations, transforming from a military disaster into something far larger, a meditation on power, ambition, and the limits of human control. In the beginning, it was simply a tale of conquest gone wrong. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, gave the world its first account: 50,000 soldiers marching toward the Siwa oasis to punish priests who refused Cambyses' commands, only to vanish when the desert turned against them. His story contained all the elements of tragedy, hubris, divine anger, sudden catastrophe. It was history told as drama. with the Persian king cast as both powerful ruler and doomed figure. Yet, as centuries passed, the tale evolved. Medieval Arab historians retold it with new details, sometimes linking the disaster to divine justice, sometimes to curses placed upon foreign invaders. European travelers in the Renaissance repeated these legends, mixing fact and folklore until the army's fate became a canvas for imagination. The absence of physical proof gave storytellers freedom to invent motives, villains, and miracles. By the 19th century, the Lost Army had become part of Western Romanticism. Painters imagined endless columns of soldiers swallowed by golden dunes. Poets compared the tragedy to Ozymandias, the mighty king whose shattered statue in the desert warns that all empires crumble. The Victorians, fascinated by archaeology and the Bible alike, saw the story as both historical puzzle and moral lesson. Modern culture has carried the legend even further. Novels set in the desert use the Lost Army as backdrop for tales of treasure, hunters, and secret maps. Films portray it with sweeping landscapes and mysterious ruins half buried in sand. Video games scatter clues about Cambyses' soldiers across digital deserts where players search for answers Herodotus never gave. Why does this story endure when so many ancient battles and campaigns have faded from memory? Part of the answer lies in scale. To lose 50,000 men and an entire army without trace feels almost impossible. History records defeats, massacres, even annihilations, but usually with bodies, weapons, or monuments left behind. Here, the desert offers nothing but emptiness. That silence invites speculation. Were they buried by a single storm or many over time? Did some survive and vanish into other lands? The lack of certainty turns historians into detectives and readers into dreamers. Another reason is setting. The Sahara itself seems like a character in the drama. Vast, indifferent, eternal. Unlike cities or kingdoms, deserts do not remember in stone or inscription. They erase. Winds shift dunes overnight, covering campsites, scattering bones, reshaping the landscape so completely that even modern satellites struggle to reconstruct the past. Against this backdrop, human ambition appears fragile, temporary, almost arrogant. Cambyses commanded kings and generals, yet he could not command the wind. The legend also speaks to universal fears. Armies represent order, discipline, civilization moving outward. The desert represents chaos, nature, the unknown. When one swallows the other, we sense more than historical accident. We sense a warning about limits. Ancient listeners might have heard divine judgment. Modern ones might hear environmental reality. Both interpretations remind us that power, whether royal or technological, has boundaries written not in law but in landscape. Yet the story is not only about loss, it has also driven centuries of discovery. Archaeologists mapping forgotten trade routes, climatologists modeling ancient weather, linguists studying Herodotus's Greek call, chase answers because of Cambyses' army. Each expedition, whether successful or not, adds knowledge about the ancient world, its roads, its oases, its people. Even if the army itself remains elusive, the search illuminates everything around it, and there is something human in the persistence of that search. From Victorian explorers with camels to scientists with drones, generation after generation refuses to let the desert have the last word. Perhaps this stubbornness reflects a belief that history owes us closure, that mysteries exist to be solved. Or perhaps we simply recognize ourselves in those soldiers, travelers through a hostile world, at the mercy of forces we only partly understand. In recent years, new technologies promise to push the boundary again. Ground-penetrating radar can detect shapes buried beneath meters of sand. DNA analysis might one day identify bones as Persian rather than Roman or Bedouin. Climate data reconstructs storms from centuries past, estimating when and where catastrophic winds likely struck. Each advance tempts us with the possibility that the next discovery will reveal everything: the root, the cause, even the final moments of 50,000 lives. And yet, some scholars argue the legend's power depends on its uncertainty. If archaeologists tomorrow uncovered a mass grave dated precisely to 525 BCE, with inscriptions naming Cambyses, would the mystery endure? Would we lose something intangible? Part of what draws poets, filmmakers, and historians alike is the not knowing, the sense that some corners of the past resist even our most determined efforts to illuminate them. Perhaps this is why the story continues to inspire art as much as science. A painting of soldiers disappearing into sand communicates something no excavation report can: the feeling of vastness, of ambition meeting its limits, of time erasing even the mightiest footprints. The legend belongs not only to Persia or Egypt or Greece, but to the human imagination itself. As night falls over the desert today, wind still moves across the dunes where Cambyses' army may lie. Satellites pass silently overhead. Bedouin guides lead travelers along ancient paths. Somewhere beneath, perhaps, rest bronze weapons or shattered shields. Or perhaps the sands hold nothing at all, and the army's true fate lies scattered across history in fragments, too small to reassemble. What remains certain is this: more than 2,000 years later, the lost army continues to march not across deserts, but through minds. It marches through books and documentaries, through campfire stories and scholarly debates, through every generation that wonders how 50,000 lives could vanish between one heartbeat and the next dot. Maybe one day, the desert will surrender its secret. Maybe technology or chance will uncover the final proof. Until then, Cambyses' lost army stands as both historical puzzle and timeless parable, a reminder that human power, no matter how vast, moves across a world that answers to no king. And so our journey ends where it began: the silence of the Sahara, beneath a sky unchanged since antiquity, with winds sweeping across dunes that have buried empires and will bury more. The soldiers of Cambyses march still, somewhere beyond reach, carrying their mystery into eternity. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. This has been the Bedtime Historian, where the past comes alive to guide you into rest. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please like, share, and subscribe for more calming tales of history. Until next time, sleep well and good night.